Thank you, Julian. Thank you, everyone who's spoken before me. And thanks, everyone, for coming. Yeah, we really hope that this California Doughnut Snapshot can serve as a compass to help orient us towards meeting the needs of all people within the limits of the planet. And I'll now explain a bit about that process of compiling indicators which make up the California Doughnut. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So before introducing the final product, the design version, I thought it might be fun to pull back the curtain a little bit and show some of our first attempts at visualizing the donut after compiling the data. So the first one here is from a website that we use, and then the second one is using RStudio. And if we jump to the next slide, you can see the results after working with the design team. The California Doughnut provides an overview of California's social and ecological performance. We'll just pause for a moment to take it in. You can see here we're falling short on 100% of social indicators and overshooting 83% of ecological indicators. Another way of thinking about that is the average social shortfall, which is 36%, and the average ecological overshoot, which is 254%. Now I want to talk a little bit about how we collected these indicators and how we assess shortfall and overshoot before we go into each category in detail. Our process started with a review of previous donut reports, like Julian mentioned, and combining that with existing social and ecological indicators for the state of California. And we considered over 200 indicators and selected around 100 as potential fits for the 20 or so categories that are generally included in donut assessments. And we collaborated with experts from DEAL, the Donut Economics Action Lab, also regional experts, and local academic, governmental, and non-governmental organizations to sort of like narrow down and improve this list, like Julian was talking about. In the next few slides, we'll dig deeper into what this visualization is really representing. But just to start off, the social foundation is made up of 24 indicators divided between 12 categories, while the ecological ceiling consists of 18 indicators divided into 9 categories. And many of these appear in other reports, but others are specific to the California context. And I think I haven't done an exact count, but around 50% of the indicators are documented by government agencies. Another 30% come from NGOs, and around 20% are from academic reports and peer-reviewed articles. With that, let's dig into the data a little bit. And you can click twice to see our spreadsheets of final social and ecological indicators. So each indicator has a current estimate and a desirable target, which are combined to assess the level of overshoot. So outside of the donut framework, it's quite common to have data points that are not linked to a desirable target, and that makes it quite difficult to assess this overshoot or shortfall. And we tried to use aspirational targets that align with the science and also what we hear from the groups we're working with on these issues in California. But we do consider this a living document, and we hope to include updates based on feedback in the future, and this goes for both the targets and the indicators themselves. And you could argue that our targets are a little too aspirational, almost impossible to achieve. This is especially true on the social side, where we generally aim for 100% or 0%. And we don't really see this as a weakness. Rather, it fits with the idea of the donut as a compass. So a compass is always pointing north, but the reason we have a compass is not to take us somewhere called north, rather is to orient us in the right direction. So now we'll talk a little more about how that manifests itself later in the presentation. And for now, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So now we zoom in on the ecological ceiling, and you see a few words to describe each indicator to go along with the general level of overshoot. So now we can see that the climate change category, for example, is made up of 2 indicators: greenhouse gas emissions and renewable electricity. These are abbreviations, of course, and the full indicator descriptions will appear in the unrolled visualization of the donut, which we'll look at in a second. Just point out quickly here that during this research, I found there was really a lack of information related to consumption-based environmental indicators for states like California, which is a large, wealthy state, and many decisions are, of course, made at the state level. So this seems like quite a gap we have in the literature and also some necessary information to inform policy. Like Julian mentioned, producing new indicators is really beyond the scope of this report. We're looking to compile existing indicators, but this is something we would love to explore further research. And we can go to the next slide, please. And click twice again to reveal the local aspirations and planetary boundaries. So this is a little bit behind the ecological ceiling that we were looking at before. Some of you guys may be familiar with this 4 lenses approach. So here we're considering 2 sides of the ecological coin. One is how our society is matching nature's generosity. This is sometimes called our local aspirations or local ecological. And then on the other side, we have how are our consumption patterns, our society's consumption patterns, impacting nature globally. This is sometimes called the planetary boundaries or the global ecological. So we considered having 2 donuts, one with the local indicators and one with the global indicators. Some reports have done that in the past. In the end, we decided to combine them into one donut. often the easier something is to understand, or I was gonna say there's some strengths and some weaknesses to both sides here. And I was just gonna point out that sometimes it's easier to understand something when you first see it, then the intricacies are lost. So we tried to find a balance here of being easy to understand, but presenting enough information to make the images meaningful and useful. And in the presentation as well, you'll see how we're digging deeper and deeper as we go on. Here you can also see the year for each indicator. And this is the year the indicator was assessed, not the year the report was published, which is quite a distinction sometimes. But we tried to use the most recent indicators available, but in some cases, there were indicators that we thought were very important to include, even though they're not being measured on a yearly basis. It's particularly true on the ecological side, and we see this report maybe as a way of encouraging our government or other organizations to consider tracking these indicators that we see as vital to our future. And given the state of information, there's sometimes this trade-off of having the best indicator to capture a topic and having an indicator that was assessed in the last calendar year. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So now we see the donut enrolled that I mentioned, the next layer of complexity. So now we can see the percent overshoot expressed numerically and also the full name of the indicator that is being assessed. I would say this is the best place to look for hotspots or discern patterns or spot discrepancies between indicators. And we can also see now that greenhouse gas emissions is measured per capita from a consumption-based perspective, and we can see that we're more than 1,000 times over the safe limit. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. You can also see that renewable electricity is measured using percent of electricity from non-renewable sources. We're kind of using a gold standard here of just solar, wind, and geothermal being considered as renewable. And as with all the indicators, this is a sort of compromise. If we included hydropower, biomass, and nuclear as renewables, our overshoot would be lower. But if we considered all energy from renewables rather than just electricity, this narrow form percentage of energy, the overshoot would actually be far higher. So this points to the fact that there's a lot behind these numbers, and we try to get into that in our section reports. And we're planning to have one section report for each category to dive deeper into these nuances that are not captured in the numbers. And we'll quickly take a look at one of those now on the next slide. Yeah, we can hear the next layer of complexity here. We see the actual data point for California along with the unit of measurement. So it's 12.1 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per capita. It's per person per year. And we also see the desirable target, which is what we're using to calculate the level of overshoot. In this case, it's 1. In this case, the target is based on downscaling the planetary boundaries framework to a per capita level that's in line with the 1.5 to 2 degree limit codified in the Paris Climate Agreement. But for everyone, it's slightly different how we're measuring that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we dive into each category. But in these reports, we try to include some of the indicators related to each category. We didn't sort of make this final cut. We only have 2 indicators for each category, but like I said, we actually considered many more indicators. And we also try to provide additional context and background, mention some of the most important policies related to the issue, and note how things are changing over time. Finally, we highlight inequalities, both within the state and between countries, to understand how power and justice impact these challenges. And the map you can see in the bottom left shows carbon footprint and how it changes depending on the neighborhood you're in San Francisco, with wealthier neighborhoods responsible for most emissions. Meanwhile, countries and locations with the least emissions will be hardest hit by climate change. And thanks to our partners at the Cool Climate Lab over at Berkeley for producing this map and also for reviewing this section for us. And now on to the social foundations. Just take a quick sip of water. So here, I think, as Julian mentioned, we see the greatest discrepancy between the California donut and the national donut, the US donut, which appear on this Good Life for All website. There's amazing studies that have been done by Andrew and the DEAL team. So this research, their research compiles data for most nations on Earth for a range of social and ecological indicators to construct these national donuts. And because the national donuts use a threshold that are applicable to many nations, it's difficult for them to really accurately capture the local context. Julian used the example of poverty line. It's a good example. And of course, we know that it doesn't work for California. And predictably, this leads to more shortfall than in the national US donut. But this shouldn't really be taken to mean the US is that California is performing below the US average, rather that we're using more aspirational targets that are more applicable to the local context. If we jump to the next slide. And here we can see the 4 lenses approach, again, applied to the social foundation. So this is how is our society meeting the needs of people within California, the social thresholds, and how the society is impacting people around the world through our consumption patterns. And sometimes that's called the global responsibilities. We found these global social indicators actually to be much more difficult to measure than any other category. It seems like it's the least researched and most underrepresented in the donut and also academic literature, at least from a quantitative standpoint. There are some interesting studies that measure appropriated wealth, labor, land, energy, and materials between nations, but none of that has been extended to the state level. And what some other donut reports have done is take a more qualitative approach to this section, looking at how stories of, for example, how local companies' practices like Apple, if you click, you can see Apple, and click one more time to see Tesla. We can think about how these companies treat workers in their factories or people in their supply chains. Or we can think about banks, California banks, investments, and click one more time, and think about how these practices impact climate change, both for local communities and abroad. And if you click one more time, we can also think about how US military interventions are impacting people in other countries. So these are all aspects of how our society is impacting people's lives in other countries. We did not include any global social indicators in this report, but a priority for future reports, at least for me, is to try to capture these global responsibilities and also to provide a time series assessment for the indicators we already have. And now I'll finish off by presenting the social foundations unrolled. Here you can see the percent shortfall and also the full indicator names. And before Stephanie zooms in on each one of these categories, I want to mention again our choice of the aspirational targets of 100%. For this national donuts, for the US donuts, these ones that we keep mentioning, they use the 95% target rather than 100% target. But in that case, if you think about water quality over here, 2% of people who are not receiving their water quality from systems, 2% of people do not receive their water from systems that meet water quality standards. And if we use that 95%, then that 2% wouldn't be considered a shortfall. But that 2% is close to 1 million Californians who are receiving their water from these problematic systems. So we thought it's important to use that aspirational target and really capture that. Yeah, with that, I would like to pass it over to Stephanie, who will take some time now to walk us through how California is performing in each category and in each indicator.